Kinda funny, I had this video all planned out and ready to go, only for the WoW Sims to be updated, requiring me to do all the recalculations again, and throwing all the hard work I had already completed right out the window. So now that I've rerun the Sims, these are what I would recommend for the best in slot for both threat and DPS. Survival stats wise, there are other pieces you can use to replace some of these to increase your survivability, but that will drop your damage per second and threat per second by a lot. So only try to replace the items listed here if you are dying. But assuming your raid healers are up to stuff and can keep you alive, this set of gear will put out very good threat per second and damage per second. Some last notes and context before looking at the gear in Sims. These are the buffs that we have enabled for our raid Sims, nothing really outside of the ordinary. These results are based on you being an enchanter and tailor for your professions to take advantage of the new epic tailoring recipes and new consumables from this phase. And the fights were simmed over multiple batches in increments of 30,000, averaging 60-second fights, with all the faction appropriate buffs, full world buffs, raid debuffs from the appropriate classes, and consumables including the new enchanting consumable. Listed below also are the rune choices and enchantment choices for the gear, because funnily enough, putting fiery enchant on your weapon is roughly a 10 DPS increase if it's fast enough to actually melee with in between spell strikes. And finally, this was also the build we used to sim these results across all races. Not much to be said, pretty standard and cookie cutter build using the imp as your pet. And if you need more time to look the talents over, feel free to pause the video. Starting off, these are the top 4 items you should strive for in order to get the maximum bang for the buck increase to your damage per second and threat per second. And luckily half of them can be done before you even step foot into the Sunken Temple. The number one thing that you should do to increase your threat and damage is to get the Dark Moon card Decay, which when paired with Infernal Pact Essence, these two trinkets sim higher, between 30 to 40 DPS higher than the next best set of trinkets, Atali Blood Ritual Charm and Infernal Pact Essence. Number 2 would be to farm Warden for the Blade of Eternal Darkness. It's simming roughly 15 DPS higher than the second best set of weapons, which are tied between Hubis, Bandit Brander, Glimmering Gizmo Blade, and Modus Karkin. Third would be upgrading to the new Crafted Epic Tailoring Shoulders, since the next best shoulders are about 10 to 15 DPS lower, especially if you're going to be raiding because of the proc effect. Lastly, the fourth would be upgrading to the Nightmare Prophet set from the Hyperconductive set. These 4 gear options will give you the biggest jump in damage per second, survivability, and threat per second compared to any other upgrade that you will get this phase. In terms of absolute BiS, you can't go wrong with this setup pictured here. It's a bit ironic how much of our BiS gear comes from dungeons and how usable the old raids and profession gear can be. Only the Nightmare set, Jindo's Lost Locket, Haku's Hex Cape, Nightmare Trophy, Atali Hexer's Gloves, and Drakeclaw Band of the Harbinger come from the new raid, while Blade of Eternal Darkness, Enthralled Sphere, Cord of the Untamed, and Cyclopean Band are the new drops from either Wild Offerings or Mardon and Blackrock Depths bosses. Lastly, Neurolinked Arcano Filament Monocle and Shoulder Pads of the Deranged come from Tailoring, the Decay Trinket from the Dark Moon Fair, and lastly Dryad's Wrist from the Warsong Gold Trep at Exalted. As you can see, there are some variants based on your race and faction, with Gnomes averaging 1,226 DPS and 2,075 threat per second, Humans 1,216 DPS and 2,058 threat per second, Undead 1,193 DPS and 2,032 threat per second, and lastly Orcs 1,192 DPS and 2,007 threat per second. All of them were averaging around 509 damage taken per second and 74% TMI, though I think this calculation is a little off on the sim for both categories, but with both results you want to have a lower number, and the lower number is better in both categories. For Pre-BiS, you want to get a hold of the same dungeon upgrades from the previous BiS list to augment your Gnomer and Tailoring gear, namely Blade of the Eternal Darkness, Enthralled Sphere, Cord of the Untamed, and Cyclopean Band. Sprycaster Cape can be skipped and instead just keep using your Bloodrot Cape from the last phase for roughly 1 DPS loss. But 1 DPS is 1 DPS, and if you are able to get Sprycaster on the way to get the other ones, you might as well take it. Also an easy to get ring upgrade would be the level 48 Warsong Gold's Reputation Ring, being equal in spell power to the Cyclopean Band ring from the Blackrock Depths, but giving less main stats. Ironically, this setup isn't that far behind in the full Phase 3 BiS in terms of DPS, although its survivability is a lot worse. Gnome should be reaching average 1,187 DPS and 2,004 threat per second, Humans 1,178 DPS and 1,991 threat per second, Undead 1,156 DPS and 1,965 threat per second, and Orcs rounding it out at 1,154 DPS and 1,941 threat per second. All races were averaging around 582 damage taken per second and 89% TMI. This last section is just comparing the Pre-BiS to the Rank 7 PvP set and Emerald Warden Reputation sets for science, but otherwise the gear setup will look exactly the same as the first Pre-BiS set that we just talked about. For the Rank 7 PvP set, Gnomes averaged 1,172 DPS and 1,982 threat per second, Humans 1,166 DPS and 1,969 threat per second, Undead 1,148 DPS and 1,950 threat per second, and Orcs finally 1,145 DPS and 1,926 threat per second. All races averaged around 547 damage taken per second and 74% TMI. As you can see, comparing the Rank 7 set to the Phase 3 BiS, the survivability is roughly the same at 560 damage taken per second and a 74% TMI, but there is a 40 to 50 DPS difference in favor of the BiS with the Sunken Temple drops included over the Rank 7. For the Emerald Reputation set, it looks a lot worse. Gnomes resulted in 1,159 DPS and 1,956 threat per second, Humans averaging 1,155 DPS and 1,948 threat per second, Undead 1,133 damage per second and 1,924 threat per second, Orcs 1,131 DPS and 1,901 threat per second. All of the races averaged out in survivability 626 damage taken per second and 90% TMI. Unsurprisingly, while Emerald Warden is the easiest set to get, it is also the worst set to use for tanking. Wrapping up the video, as you can see, at least in terms of tanking, the Emerald Warden set isn't a bad starting point, especially for alts, new or returning players who didn't raid Gnomer. But if you are able to pull together some or any PvP gear, Gnomer gear, and /or the crafted tailoring epics before Sunken Temple, you can easily surpass it in basically every important stat possible. Overall, with how much power there are in the previous phase items and the new dungeon drops introduced this phase, you can very easily gear up relatively well doing only dungeons, old raids, and PvP without ever setting foot into the new raid, and be extremely ready for the road from 50 to 60. However, it is undeniable that if you want to push your character to the max in terms of parses, DPS, and survivability for this phase, you'll have no choice but to step into the new Sunken Temple raid and go after a few select drops, because basically every other caster wants those drops as well. If you enjoyed our analysis, be sure to like the video and subscribe to be notified of future videos. Thanks for tuning in and have a good night.